Okay. Oh, somebody. Isaac, how are you? Okay, so I think we're going to get started. Just
Excellent.
Isaac. All right.
Perfect.
So everyone, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. As is our tradition, let me begin by honoring and acknowledging that we here in Edmonton are on traditional Treaty 6 territory, as such, an important trading center for the Métis Nation. So today we're lucky to have Joel and Justin join us. We're going to go through entrepreneurial resilience. And I know Joel personally has had experience dealing with some trials and tribulations of entrepreneurship, and that has made it a passion of his to not only speak to this, but to step up and help in this area. So I'm going to hand it over to you fellows. I'm going to mute my mic and we'll get started.
Great. Well, thanks for having us and taking some time on your lunch hour to join and to chat. So, of course, I'm Justin, and co-host here is Joel.
Nice to meet you, everybody.
And yeah, so we obviously had a focus of this as entrepreneurial resiliency, which is very thematic, and I know part of what the Maji Center does. And the goal is to go deep as much as we can, but it's only an hour, and so you can't go super deep. And so we want to give you a couple practical exercises rather to revisit as some of the threads that you can go deeper with on your own time, and hopefully build and grow your own practice of resiliency much before you need it. And so just as a FYI, to remind people, within the chat, there is the document that the Google Doc that you can carry a copy of and use to follow along as a worksheet. And yeah, with that, let's jump into the agenda here. So we're going to do a bit of a story. So just Joel and I share a little bit of who we are and why we're here, and our story. Talk a little bit about why resiliency matters. And then jump into sort of three parts. One is a bit of a quick exercise that we do. And so we'll do a little bit of a breakout exercise into a couple of rooms where we do a bit of an awareness piece. Talk a little bit about strategies to build resilience in a bit more detail with some exercises that we can have and use both now and later. And then, getting a little bit more vulnerable and sharing what we've learned and putting that to practice right here in another breakout session. And so we'll have a few Q&A at the end as kind of the last of it. And so with that, who we are. So I'm Justin. Personally, I'm a lover of outdoors. I love all sports, particularly hockey and soccer, which I play, which has been unfortunate, of course, during COVID times, not being able to do those, but we find other things. I've been a mentor to entrepreneurs and product managers, where I currently head a team at a startup company here in Edmonton for product management. And I started a few companies, and some of them have been acquired, and other of them have, been the failures that I really draw from in some of the resiliency stories that I share today.
Yeah, I'm Joel McGalnick, and like Justin, I have been a part or started companies that have failed. I unfortunately didn't have any that were acquired. I kind of wrote a bunch of them kind of downward down the toilet and then ended up having to walk away. But today I'm actually a consultant, and I do work with companies, some of them startups, some of them larger organizations. And I actually do consider that an entrepreneurial effort because I am actually, running my own business and came up with an idea that I executed on and have continued to grow over time. So, but having that experience of failure, of having to walk away from a business, and Justin having had that same experience, he had this idea of doing a podcast for quite a while. And one of the things that I do with the consulting company that I run is to actually develop podcasts for companies. And so we ended up coming together about a year and a half ago and launched the Back in Business podcast, which you can find pretty much anywhere. And we talk with entrepreneurs, experts in fields of things like mental health and coaching, and really kind of tell those stories and have our guests really go deep, sometimes get very emotional about the experiences they've had with failure and how they were able to come back from that.
And I think there's really a need for honesty in storytelling, because we'll often look at the headlines and we'll see Elon Musk is succeeded from failure, but it's so distant. And so having that honest story about people in our local community, a lot of our podcasts are folks from within Edmonton and Alberta, and so sharing those stories for people that are succeeding in the small and medium business category is really important. So um, with that, why does resilience matter? And so, very, very briefly, of course, resiliency has a couple, definitions, one being the very sciencey focused one. But there's kind of that personal one, right? Which is the ability to grow and recover, from misfortune and change. And
Yeah,
so, there's some key elements within that, right? We're going to talk about a bunch of these today as we go through. And some of them focus within yourself and how you look at yourself, and others are, how do you engage with the world around you?
yeah. And the other thing to ask yourself too is what is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur can be somebody who's doing something incredibly innovative, creating a startup, kind of like Justin mentioned the name Elon Musk, of somebody who, he before he was the guy behind SpaceX and Tesla, he and Peter Thiel co-founded PayPal, which nobody had ever thought of before. Like, oh, I can actually pay somebody by sending them an email, which at the time, 20 something years ago, was an amazing new concept. But an entrepreneur can also be somebody who, maybe the first person in their family, for example, to start a business of their own, to really kind of go out there and say, I don't want to work for somebody. I want to set my own destiny, for better or for worse. And those people are entrepreneurs as well.
And the struggles and the emotional journey that people go through can be similar in both of those situations, because it's a very
Absolutely.
personal experience, right? And so we'll get a bit more into that as we go through. So the next piece here, of course, is a couple pieces of why it really matters, and one of the big pieces is the effort, right? So as an entrepreneur, you're going to be working very hard. Generally, that's the case. You make your own rules, as Joel suggested, right? But you're going to work hard, and so the average stats for earnings is about 60K in Canada that you'll earn. And it's interesting to note that this, of course, is skewed because some people are making hundreds of thousands or more, and others are scraping by, with 20 or 15, or maybe it's a side hustle
Or
and they're
zero.
making, or zero, right? And it's all part of the starting of it. So, I think it's realistic to have an awareness of what that number, usually ends up being, because it's an important piece of the puzzle to know where the general line in the sand is. The
Mhm.
second piece is just the hours of the day, right? And so you're going to work long hours, and so part of building resilience is finding that strong purpose and desire to say, what, I am going to work those 14 hours because I'm going to be fulfilled, or because I have control, or because of other pieces of the puzzle that are important to you. Um, and so you need to be able to, at the end of the day, justify the time spent versus the opportunity cost of working the 9 to 5. And is it an investment that you can afford now or in the future, or as a side hustle? Because maybe you have student debt that you still have to work through. Maybe you're doing this after the 9 to 5 because you need to sustain yourself, and those are all realistic things to consider as an entrepreneur.
Yes, as an entrepreneur, I did all of those things. And, the first startup that I had, I was working on weekends, sitting in coffee shops at my computer while I had two little children at home that I wasn't necessarily paying attention to as much as I could have. So there are other costs as well to think about.
Exactly.
And, ultimately they very well may be worth it.
So the next piece here that I think is really important is the emotions, and we're gonna actually go reasonably deep into this. But as an entrepreneur, as anybody, to be honest, whatever you're doing, we ride emotional roller coasters at times. Specific to entrepreneurs, right? The number of entrepreneurs who struggled regularly with imposter syndrome, and imposter syndrome is really the notion that I don't have the skills, or I'm not good enough, or I'm experienced enough to do whatever it is I'm trying to do, and so I'm faking it till I'm making it. But that faking experience can be very exhausting, particularly if you don't
Mhm.
have a strong network. Um, the other pieces that are the other piece here that's really important is just the number of entrepreneurs who feel isolated and unrelatable, right? So often when you have a conversation with somebody who is not in the entrepreneurial grind, you might actually be in a very different risk or perspective of how to work through things. And so you might not think you have the ability to reach out or have people understand what you're really doing through or going through, even though they might mean the best, right? So,
Mhm.
you know, how do you approach things when somebody calls you an imposter or you call yourself an imposter, right? How does your identity play into that space? And I think it's important to understand how we can shift our identity by separating, the words that we use to describe ourselves from the actual things that we do.
Mhm. And your mood can definitely play a part in this as well. If you're exhausted, if you've been putting 14-hour days in without taking a break, without uh, having a couple days off or getting enough sleep, you're more likely to have a lower, your mood's most likely going to be lower than if you are well rested, if you have a good diet and that kind of thing. And that means that you will more often feel like an imposter because you're not able to kind of overcome that hump of having that feeling of being refreshed. And that's also a thing that many entrepreneurs struggle with.
And
Is that
so
self-care? Yeah.
the next piece here that I think is interesting is failure, right? And so, we're often told to fail forward, fail fast, all these kind of things. And all those are valuable. But resilience really matters because of failure. And so some stats say as high as 9 and 10. Some of those, it really depends on what you define as failure. And failure can be really just not meeting the expectations you set out for yourself. Strictly to the explicit to business numbers, the number is closer to probably 50% of businesses fail after 5 years, and by failure, it's kind of they've closed shop and can't sustain themselves anymore. And so there's a number of reasons why that might be the case. But sometimes that's a slow bleed, and sometimes it's a tragic or very public failure.
Crash and burn. Yes.
Crash and burn, right? And so for myself, I slow dripped for a business for a year, and it depleted some of my savings or most of my savings. And when I finally chose to go back to a 9 to 5 for a little while, I was basically starting from scratch. And so there's a lot of emotions that wrapped up in that around I'm a failure because I couldn't make something work, and there's a lot of different pieces. But I think it's really important to know that it's okay to go back to a 9 to 5 and shift again your identity from being an entrepreneur to being somebody who is entrepreneurial. And so there's a number of means to help do that.
Right. And an interesting thing, I saw a speaker once a few years ago, and one of the things that he said was, this person worked in a large tech company, and he said, you can be entrepreneurial inside the company and still kind of get that same feeling of innovating, inventing things, taking charge. So sometimes entrepreneurism doesn't have to be your own personal grind. And that
So
that and yeah, and just to add to that, like if you are making that shift, that you are still you can still be an entrepreneur even if your business itself has failed, and that is a form of resiliency.
I think we talked about this slide. I think I forgot to switch to it.
Yeah.
So what choices can you make, right? So this is an important question. So if we look at around the room and look at the faces and the names in the WebEx right now, right? 9 out of 10 of us are going to fail, and so what can you control to make that meaningful? The piece that I think is really frustrating, and I know it stuck with me, is that there's all these fluffy platitudes and the posters on the wall that are supposed to be inspirational, but there's no real meaning to them, right? It's like, oh, fail forward, or like here's some inspirational BS quote, and they don't really have a path out of that, particularly if you're face down in the mud and you're in a position of pain and grief and all the other things that happen when you fail and fail big, particularly as an entrepreneur. there's no real like, okay, what are the couple steps to get out of that? And that's really 100% resiliency. It's, knowing that you have a network and knowing of other things. And so, those are really big pieces. And so if 9 out of 10 of us are going to fail, how can we be more compassionate with ourselves and others as we talk about our failures and as we work through those? And the real question, of course, which is somewhat rhetorical because we're talking about it, is can we build resilience before we need it? And so that's what we're going to dig a little bit more deeper into in the next few slides. So with that, I just want to jump into our first breakout exercise. So Cecile's going to help us. We're going to split off into probably rooms of about 4 per group. And we're going to spend about 5 minutes. So it's going to feel really quick. And you can use some of the prompts on the first page. I've got multiple screens, so I'm kind of looking side to side here. But on page 1, there's the breakout exercise worksheet, which is really about spending those few minutes to think of a time you failed at something, whether it be or something that failed to meet expectations as a failure, or maybe it actually just turned out really, really bad, right? And that could be something as simple as a test or maybe a bad date. It could be something bigger than that if you're wanting to be, more vulnerable right now with the group. But it can also just be something simple. And the simple work is often the way that we build it in non-threatening ways. So maybe it's your bad, cookies that you baked during the early stages of COVID. But write it down in the space provided and include how you felt. So there's 3 bullet points for some 3 emotions that you might have felt or things that you felt during that experience. If you can't think of anything, think of a time that in the future where something that you could fail at, right? So again, maybe it's a test coming up, maybe it's a number of things, but think of what as an example it could be, and so we can break out and have a conversation there.
Yeah, and the link again for you to make a copy of that doc is in the chat if you haven't gotten that already.
Perfect. So we'll break out for a really quick 5 minutes. If you want to, when in the breakout room, share with the group kind of what you've come up with or what your statement would be, and just have a quick conversation. But we'll do it that way.
And Cecile, they'll be able to see the screen in each of the breakout rooms as well.
No.
No. Okay.
So that's why the worksheet was helpful.
Still have a few
But we can jump in, Joel, so we can jump back and forth.
Okay, great.
Isaac, Christopher, and Charles, you need to join your room you were assigned to. Olivia, you were assigned to a room. Can you see the link?
Perfect. There we go. Yeah, Charles can join as well.
You should have a link to join if you're still there.
Okay. So we'll come back at 24-ish.
I've got 4 more minutes. 4 more minutes according to my.
Perfect.
Okay.
And then Joel, we could probably somewhat pick up the pace. We're on 10. Some of the slides are a bit heavier. Because it'll be 25. Just thinking about the timing here.
And do you want the same groups when we break out again, or do you want them mixed up? Does it matter?
I'm not sure that it matters all that much. It might be good to have the same groups just because then they'll be familiar with each other's stuff.
Okay. Ryan's group doesn't have all the questions. What are they supposed to be discussing right now? What part of the worksheet? First
Page
part?
1. Yeah, just page 1. So basically discussing what their example might be and how they might have felt. So I'm going to drop into a room for a couple minutes and see how things are going.
Yeah, I'll do that as well. Which room are you going to go into, Justin?
He's gone.
He's gone. Oh, he's quick. Okay, he's in number 2. I will go into room 1. So I think we're about to drop out, right?
Yeah, well, I accidentally forgot to click a button, so now they've got a little bit more time. You can see the clock at the top corner.
No.
No, or maybe I only see it. So they've got 30 seconds.
Okay.
Perfect. So we'll get people joining back in here.
Mm-hmm.
So is the presentation back up here?
Looks like we're all back. Okay, I think we probably need to turn the presentation back on.
Okay. Perfect. So I think I got that going back again.
Yep.
So one of the things that, it's fun to talk about in some ways and challenging in others is, this awareness piece of, vulnerability and feelings, right? And so as the one sharing, if you were sharing things, reflect on, how did that feel? Was it awkward? Was it easy? Was it, surface level where you're not able to go like super deep with the content? And how honest were you with the full details or the really important details that makes you more vulnerable, right? Where was your sentence that you captured in your worksheet, or that you had put down to describe your experience, was it long or was it very short and brief, right? And then on the flip side, if you were the one listening, right, how did it feel to listen, or to perhaps read some of the stories that people maybe posted them in the chat of that group? Did you have an urge to jump in and offer support or your perspectives? Did you distance yourself from the problem, saying you maybe don't relate to it? um, and did you hear perhaps anything between the words that were shared, right? So did you project any assumptions that you might have, or values that you have into the story that others shared? Did you hear maybe more that was actually shared, right? So if someone maybe shared, that they were, so in the group that I joined, we talked about fear and anxiety, and, was there maybe more there that you wanted to pull out? So these are two really, really good pieces to capture. And again, I'll share the slides afterwards so you can kind of reflect on those. Um, but they really lead to this takeaway piece as a practice, which is, what do we just do, right? So essentially, we did a very lightweight, and hopefully somewhat playful, or perhaps very real conversation on some of the strategies that build resilience. And so those are doing some journalizing or journaling or visualizing. So if you captured the past exercise, then that would be more of the journaling and reflecting on that. Or if you're looking to the future and visualizing what was happening, those might be opportunities to look forward and say, how could I do things differently? The other piece that's really important is actually finding the courage to talk to someone. One of the, putting out the vibe perhaps, right, is just like, hey, this is what I was feeling, this is where I was. Because if we put that out and we find that courage to do that, we let other people in to help and support, and maybe hear things we don't hear about ourselves. And thirdly, of course, is saying out loud it and posting it publicly. And so, that's a pretty big risk.
Absolutely.
You want to jump in there, Joel?
Yeah, for sure. I you use the word reflection, and I think being reflective in this area is really important, because in particular when we talk about the previous two slides, where having that awareness and letting go of that vulnerability, the more that you're able to do something like that, the easier it becomes to be able to share those experiences and to let people in to be able to actually help you. And so when you are putting out that vibe, when you are trying to let things go, you can actually start to let go of some of the platitudes and be able to see like, yes, actually, I do have value. And when I do have value, I can fail forward, meaning that I can, speak to mentors and, allow myself to be more vulnerable. So we can, have that ability to be more clear as we think about the next things we do in our lives or, start something new.
Yeah. So on the next slide here, I really focus on the tip of the wedge. So part of this strategy is building your support network before you need it, right? So perhaps someone that was sharing something with you really resonated with you, and they could be part of that. Like, hey, I'm trying to do this entrepreneurial thing. It's new to me, but let's struggle together because we can relate to each other, right? So that I won't go into the full details. I've made some comments in the workshop notes at the very end. But three really, really practical ways to build that support network are through a personal community, right? So friends and families or peer groups of people that are doing things that you're doing. Mentors are really people that inspire you and, probably want you to succeed. And those can be people that you seek out. And there's some strategies that, like I said, in the workshop workbook. And forming a personal board of directors is another one. So, maybe you're looking for someone to help you with finance, and that very specific skill set you can find in one person. But another person you could ask to, perhaps help you with your people, skills. And so you can really pick and choose a bunch of different people that will help help you succeed in very specific ways instead of asking for that from everything from one person.
For sure. And actually one thing that I've run into and that a number of people that I've spoken with have run into is that the first people that they bring in or want to talk with their ideas about or moving forward about can be the people who are closest to them, their family, their closest friends. And oftentimes the response that an entrepreneur might get is not the one they're expecting, because these people love them, they want them to be stable, they want them to be safe, and they see entrepreneurialism as too big of a risk and may try to dissuade them. So it could be that your most personal, closest network is not the right network to actually help you move forward and create that support network that you need to succeed with your business.
And the flip side of that is that they might, in their hope to make you feel better, give you, advice that says, oh, well, whatever you're doing is perfect, when in fact it's the critical feedback you really need, and that honest feedback rather than, the desire to support you.
Exactly.
So we want to jump onto some strategies here. We're going to be probably blowing through these pretty quick. And that's why, again, I'm sharing the slides and the worksheet later. But there's three big pieces to build resilience that I found and did, a year into 2 years of research, really uncovering when I was on my own desert walk post-failure. And so the three categories, we'll jump into them in the next few slides here, are really understanding your emotions, changing your language, and building a learning approach. And so, when we talk about the emotional side of things, there's three kind of pieces that are really interesting to kind of think about. And so one is that this push and pull. And so negative and positive emotions generally work in concert. And when we're trying to make sense of things, either proactively or reactively, once we've failed, the negative emotions we have really motivate. So if I'm angry or frustrated, I'll probably want to, be really aggressive or assertive and do something about it. But if I'm really happy, I can use that in a different light and say, well, how do I be more happy, or how do I get back to that state of mind that that's been really helpful? The second piece, of course, is that energy is in motion. And so one of the interesting concepts is that our physiology, so like what we feel in our bodies. So if I'm angry, I will actually feel anger throughout my body. I will feel, my blood moving faster. I will feel the tingling in my, in my fingers or feet or wherever. And I will actually physically feel those things, which will then drive additional feelings and thoughts. And so you can really snowball into how that affects your physiology. And the third piece, which Joel will jump in and talk about, is really about overcoming that anxiety. And so, we can't always talk, or what we can talk about emotions to drive us forward, but sometimes the roadblocks aren't actually the emotions or some of the stuff. It's actually our own blockers that we put in front of ourselves because we're anxious or we're fearful of some of those things.
Yes, and that anxiety and fear can actually stop us right in our tracks. And oftentimes the anxiety is it's there because it's relevant. Like maybe I won't make enough money, but the idea that you're creating a level of fear within yourself is going to stop you from moving forward. And I think what we've seen in the past year, I actually teach courses at McEwen University, and I've had to talk with a number of students who have been facing levels of anxiety that they haven't faced before because of the unknowns of a pandemic, of maybe their families not having the income that they did before this happened, and in general here in Alberta with the economy that that we've been dealing with, that kind of adds on as well. And so one of the books that I read recently, the author talked about how excitement and anxiety are very similar. They kind of come from the same place in our brains. So if you're able to take that anxiety and try to put something of a positive spin on it, to try to turn it into excitement, that's a way to kind of help you over that roadblock and continue to move forward.
Yeah, exactly. Great points. So the other piece here that I think is, and again, a lot of these we'll just lightly touch on and you can look at later, but is really drawing the feelings out of ourselves and others, right? And so, part of that is asking better questions, and being present in the moment when we do feel things, right? Letting those feel. And being persistent with ourselves and others. So by persistence, one of the things that people often do is they'll say, oh, how are you doing, or they'll try to engage with somebody, and our friends and families aren't mind readers, and so if you say oh, I'm doing fine, well, that kind of closes you off and doesn't actually let them in to say actually I'm kind of hurting and things are really hard. This is the toughest thing I've done in my life. And, I don't need you to do it for me, but, I could use some help right now. And so one of the really good strategies, and this is, something you can do as you reflect later on, is setting boundaries within your questions, right? So instead of saying, how are you doing? You could ask somebody, how are you doing today? Right? If someone is going through grief and maybe they lost somebody, or they're going through a big identity piece because, they failed a business, instead of asking how are you doing, which really wraps up all that history, you could say how are you doing today, because it really separates the moment from all the other pieces, and it makes it a bit more bite-sized and tangible. So really good strategy there. The other piece is to give voice to your feelings, and we've already done that with the first exercise by sharing that with other people.
Exactly.
So the next piece here is really talking about language. And so an interesting tidbit as a fact is that there's about 34,000 words to describe emotions. And yet most people have a vocabulary emotionally of about 12 words. And so, think about that yourself in terms of, how many words do you describe emotions and how many words do you share about things? And it might surprise you because finding the right label and finding the correct word can actually give you a lot of ways to explore the word itself, and you can research its parts. So as an example, grief is a really heavy word. It's a really heavy topic. And it has a whole bunch of different pieces to the thing. It's got identity, it's got loss, it's got, longing, all these different pieces. And so once you unpack that word, once you find the right word, you can actually go in and look at objectify it, say, okay, it's grief that I'm feeling. This is really hurtful. This is really painful. But you can say, grief contains these type of emotions, and you can say, well, how would I deal with longing? What strategies can I use to deal with that? If part of grief is longing, maybe I can go talk with somebody about that lost piece, right? If it's about identity, maybe I can look at how do I repurpose how I define myself as identity. And so those can be really, really powerful as pieces of those puzzles.
Yeah, I don't
And
think
it
we're
also
seeing
helps
that
break
slide,
permanence.
Justin. Justin, are we,
Oh,
I'm still seeing the emotion slide. Okay, there we
yeah,
go.
my apologies. My
Yep.
apologies. So yeah, so the breadth, the finding the right label, and the objectification. So I talked a bit about those things.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the strategies that I've learned is, if there's a word, something identity, and oftentimes if it kind of ties in with the imposter syndrome as well. That if somebody says, "Well, you're not good enough at this," or you tell yourself, "I'm not good enough at this," if you just keep saying that word of what that is, that barrier to you, just say it to yourself over and over and over, and at some point it starts to sound just silly. And at that point, that's when you realize, oh wait, this is silly. I can wrestle this thing to the ground. I can take it over and overcome that.
So some couple strategies here, just again quickly, because we're trying to burn through some of the content here, which is there's a lot. And so um, one of the really playful ways to do this is actually grab, a thesaurus. If you actually have a physical one, awesome, because they're not that common anymore. I know I've grabbed one and kind of gone down a rabbit hole. But even if you do some Google searches, right, or some online searches, you can find um, look at the words and language, right? So again, the group that I was chatting with talked about fear and anxiety. And so those are very real things. What are the synonyms for those? What are the words that are connected to that are close but not quite that? And maybe there's some answers in there in terms of understanding that, or using a word map to link those together. The other piece of this as a pretty good strategy is understanding the stories we tell ourselves. And like Joel was saying, if I tell myself, that I'm a failure, if I tell myself, certain stories, they can be either, really debilitating, or you can find, humor in them or silliness in them
Mhm.
and
Or
kind of help
empowerment.
get over them. Right. And so, the stories we tell ourselves are really, really important, because what we tell ourselves might not actually be the truth. It might be what we feel, but what we feel might not be, the right content, because we're only seeing part of the story. And I think a really valuable piece is that other people, and we've had podcast guests share it with us, other people see in you what you often cannot see in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important, right? So I'm going to repeat that. Often people see in you what you cannot see in yourself. We're often so tied up in that moment, or tied up in that challenge, that we lose sight of all the different perspectives that people share. And so that's really, really important to shift, what your perspective is on that. And again, it helps provide new data and insights, so we can actually, get through that hump, or get over that initial hump, to start pulling ourselves out of a place that's really challenging.
Right. And this is really where that personal board of advisors or the mentors can be incredibly helpful, because they're the ones who are going to be honest and not only hold your feet to the fire, but also say, this is, you actually are really good at this. And the reason that you're starting this business is because you knew this was something that you could be successful at. And the rest is details.
Piece that out, right? So instead of using global platitudes of, this is hard, you could say, well, this piece of the puzzle is hard, and it's bleeding into these other areas. And so they can say, well, you are really good at this thing, but this you're not. So let's get you help here. So that's a really great way to do that. So the third piece is quicker to describe, but really complex to do. And it's really about oscillating between confronting something and taking a break. And you can't change the mistake or the situation where you didn't meet your expectations, but you can definitely choose how you respond. And so part of that sense making comes from confronting it, right? So if you're self accountable and you look at the emotions and events that led up to that failure, you know, what was I accountable for? What were the things that I contributed? Did I prepare enough? Did I, reach out and use my network as much as I could have, etc. Those type of things you can kind of really reflect and say, well, how would I do things differently? But eventually, when you confront all those heavy things, there's emotions tied to those, and they can really swell up, right? You might become more anxious the more you try to confront those challenges you face. And so eventually there's a time, and this is something you'll have to feel for yourself. And this is also why, using the example of, your failed cookie recipe during COVID is a great way to do it, because it's a light, small, bite-sized thing rather than, I failed a course or I failed my business. And now I need to unpack that because that's a lot more complex. But you can take a break and say, you know what, when my emotions rise up, I'm going to take a break and do some creative project that brings me joy or distracts me and gives me that spark that I need to kind of restart.
Right. And starting something new, it shouldn't be like, okay, I'm gonna knock something off of my to-do list because you can do that and you can sort of have that feeling of, okay, I got something done. But the idea of something creative, this might be writing in a journal. It might be that like, hey, I want to take up painting. I've never done that before. Drawing, doodling even, just something that allows your brain to put itself into a new space for you to really spark new ideas to help you move forward and really make you become more resilient.
And I think something, fun that you would enjoy, right? It's not,
Mhm.
Oh, I'm going to start another company now, kind of thing, right?
Right.
Um,
You're right, writing in your journal, this is for you. Nobody else cares. Nobody else needs to know. But it's you spurring your brain.
exactly. So a couple strategies here to help build resilience on the learning side are thinking in bets. And so there's a great book by Annie Duke, and she talks about separating the decision making from resulting. And resulting is kind of, if I, you know, if I were to redo what I did, would I make the same decision, or am I associating that it was a bad date with all the prep that I did, or things like this, right? So if you win the lottery, would you still constantly put your money into the lottery? Maybe, right? But the decision has to be separate from the results. Um, the other piece that's really useful as a second kind of thing is to do a failure audit or a failure post-mortem, depending on the language you want to use, but really pull out ego and blame and shame and some of these really heavy things that people tend to associate with failure or put labels onto when they're failed. And take a look at a really structured way. There's some great forms out there, some great worksheets that you can use to do this. Because at the end of the day, as April says here, as one of our guests, failure is just information, right? Our ego sees it as a threat, or our ego sees all these different pieces and puts those onto this big, wheel cart that we're trying to drag around with us, and we don't have to do that. It's definitely stressful because if I fail, as an entrepreneur, that's how I sustain myself. That's how I make money. But that failure doesn't actually have to be associated with the information that you're putting on the plate.
Yeah, and unfortunately, our ego is kind of the revisionist historian in these stories oftentimes because we do want to try to make ourselves look better. And when we do that, if we're lying to ourselves when we're telling us these stories, they can become harmful because that means that we're going to start making those same mistakes again. So if we can actually step back and remove ourselves, remove that, again, that shame and blame and the ego, we can actually test, we can filter, we can figure out what's actually true and what's not true. And when we have that truth, that's really going to help us tell our stories better and move forward in a positive way.
So with that, there's been a ton of information. We scratched the surface of a bunch of things and given you a couple little ideas. We want to take a few minutes. I know it says 10 here, but we'll probably end up doing 5 because I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So we can jump back into the breakout rooms. And as we do that, use the worksheet that's there. There's a couple questions to help guide the conversation, and just talk about it. And you can add in the actual details for your own story later on. But take a few minutes and kind of revisit the stories that you shared with some of these different strategies. And like I said, the worksheet has a couple pieces. Those are kind of on page 3, I believe, where you can kind of put it all together. And some of those questions are, who could I turn to help, right? So how can I build my network to access and to get support? Would there be a different question that I could ask to reframe the situation? Are there new words as emotions that maybe I think that might be a better fit? And what could I maybe have done differently? So I think with that, let's jump into some groups and kind of talk about these things for a few minutes.
Or do we have everybody? A few people
Well, if it's
still up.
Bernadine and Azure, you need to join your breakout. Oh, they've left. Bernadine says it's not showing left.
Um,
So I'm gonna join a meeting there.
okay,
Is
I'm
it-
trying to see that screen now where I can.
Participants, you got main meeting and breakouts. So I'll join breakout 1 this time.
Um, I'm actually having trouble figuring out.
Can you
So
see
since
in
I
the
can't,
participants list that should say the breakouts?
yeah, I'm not seeing a place for the participants list.
So at the bottom, right, you should see a
Oh,
little
there
person
we go.
sign, participants and chat,
Okay, great. I'm
and
gonna,
then you should see the list, and then you can click whichever one you want to join.
yeah, okay, cool. As we come back in, I want to thank the people in the group that I joined for being so open and vulnerable. I think that vulnerability and that openness is really what drives us toward resilience. Right, Justin, do we have you here?
There we go. So am I presenting now? Is everybody good?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, so we had
So,
we
yeah.
had a question in the chat before we can take some live questions too. Um, from Mohammed that I think we should address, and kind
Yep.
of that detecting your anxiety. One of the things that I suggest that people do when I'm coaching is that this is not a one-time thing, that this is something that you need to pay attention to on a regular basis of when you're feeling anxiety. What are some of those first physical manifestations? And it's something that you should pay attention to as you move forward. And if you're seeing something like Azure said, strange feeling in chest or fear or nervousness, is, maybe write it down or just somehow document what those feelings are like. And once you understand those, you can feel them coming on for the first time. That's when you can actually, do the thing of flip it on its head of, oh, am I feeling like, am I getting that that nervous tingle? What can I do to just sit down and relax and understand? And so as you, spend the time to get to know yourself and know those triggers, that's how you can move past them and alleviate.
Yeah, for sure. And I think some of the other things too is like when we recognize that physiology piece, we can also recognize the words that we're using and if that's causing that. So if there's a situation where, I'm frustrated, I might actually say, okay, I'm feeling frustrated, but I'm going to replace that frustration with curious. And so instead of looking at the negative space, I'm gonna look at the positive space. You could do a couple of things like that, or maybe you say, if I'm frustrated, maybe a word that's a little softer is that I'm annoyed or I'm peeved, right? And so by softening some of that language, it helps diffuse, the feeling that we have, and it's a feedback loop with how we're doing things. The other piece is really around, can I use that as a trigger? So if I'm feeling these things where I'm feeling anxious, what are the 3 strategies that I can use to repurpose that or to redirect that?
Exactly. We've only got a couple minutes. Does anybody have any other questions? Please don't be shy. I know people were kind of quiet in the breakout rooms, but we're here. We want to help you. We really do.
Like in general, I don't know that much about business. Like if you want to start a business, is it like hundreds of pages of paperwork and tons of fees, or is it like relatively simple if you can find the right people?
So I think you've got a few questions in there. The first one is the paperwork. Depending on the kind of business that you're starting, it may be kind of minimal, and it's something that you should probably talk to an accountant about. The people aspect is a much different thing. Sometimes you may just want to start something on your own and go forward. But if you do want to do something with people, they should be people that you trust. Absolutely. And that's really the most important thing. Probably should be people that you have known for a while because that has kind of established that level of trust. And if you can find people who have different skills, so you can kind of create a rounded out business, like a core team, that will help you with your success.
And Azure, we have a team of people to help you with all the paperwork and process, right? It's basically coming up with an idea and knowing what your market is, and we can work with you on that.
Yeah, don't let the paperwork stop you from moving forward. It's administrative.
Thank you.
You can,
Yeah,
you can get past that.
I had this idea that's supposed to be a fake idea for business communications, but the problem is I feel like it's turning into a more and more real idea, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Those are
That's
fine.
great.
I think the piece there is that an idea is often like a little tiny candle flame. But you don't have to foster that flame yourself, right? There's a ton of resources out there. Nate has a great bunch of resources to support that. Within Edmonton, there's another broader group of support out there. So really, again, be vulnerable with your idea. An idea you know, a lot of people think that idea is actually the value. It's the execution of the idea.
Exactly.
If you have an idea, you're probably one of 1,000 or 100,000 people that might have that idea. The real change or the real value is taking that idea and making it real. And that's
Right.
where drawing on that network of people, hopefully that you've built. But if you haven't, there's a ton of people that are really excited to help you succeed. And there's, I think that's really worth leaning into.
Right. And you being that one person out of that 100,000 with that idea who actually executes, that's what makes you the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, yeah, I have a
Sorry.
question.
Yeah.
What?
I'm just wondering about, you had said something about when other people are giving you advice or making comments about your entrepreneurial decisions. So how do you know when you're getting good advice and when you're getting bad advice? Because I know sometimes I might be getting good advice, but I'm just my own opinions and thoughts. I'm just super biased. And so it's hard for me to kind of like be open and think about like whether or not I'm actually getting good advice or whether they are just like they have their own biases that are, you know.
Yeah.
I don't think you
Justin,
can
do you want
ever
to take
pull
it?
bias. Yeah, so I don't think you can ever pull bias out of anybody's opinions, whether it be your own or whether it's others. But you know, a good method is just getting a second opinion, right? Again, the idea itself is generally not rare or valuable. It's your execution. And so, you know, if you want to know something more, you know, get more information. Information can come from conversation with others and getting their perspectives. It could be you reading a book or, you know, doing some Google searches on some articles on that. And at the end of the day, you know, as an entrepreneur, you're going to have to make decisions. Some are harder than others, and some are going to be based on feel and gut. And you know, that's part of the learning process. You know, if it was easy and obvious, you know, it would be everybody would be entrepreneurs and we'd all be successful. But it's about taking those risks and saying, based on all the information I have at the time, and this is about thinking in bets, which I mentioned earlier. You know, my three bets that I can make in this situation might be a choice between path A, B, and C, and those paths might be 40, 30, and 20% confidence. But I need to make the best bet that I can with the information that I have available at the time, because making a decision allows you to get more information and running with it. And maybe in the future, that same bet, the decision making that you build towards that might be like an 80 or 75 because you have a lot more confidence now. But to get from that 40 to that 75, you know, you need to take some action and learn a few things. And sometimes that's taking the wrong action, but going down that path and realizing, you know what, this wasn't the right advice for me, and that's okay, but I'm going to get, you know, some more advice, or I'm going to get some different advice and keep iterating now that I have more information.
Yeah. You know, Justin said get a second opinion. I would say get a fifth opinion and an eighth opinion. And really, you know, whatever it is that you feel like the businesses that you want to start, speak with the people that you think would be your customers and find out if whatever it is that you're creating would actually be viable. Because they're the ones who will tell you.
We're happy to, if you want to reach out to us with a few more questions, like we're happy to field those and you know, share some thoughts and advice as well. Because yeah, I mean, we're both very, very passionate about this stuff and helping others. So
yeah, I'm gonna actually paste my LinkedIn address into the chat. Justin, did you want to do that also, or put a contact piece of contact info?
Well, if there's no other questions, I'm thinking it's time to wrap up. But I do want to thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your experience, and hopefully the exercises, I know it was a short time frame, but gave everybody some ideas of ways to be resilient. Just a reminder, our Innovation Challenge reception is next week, March 25th. If you'd like to attend, please let me know. I have money. I have money to spend sending our students to events, workshops, short courses, so please contact me. And March 31st, winning strategies with the City of Edmonton. Also a reminder that we do have business development specialist program through Dale, who's with the ERIN. So if you're a NAIT student or alumni and you're working on a business idea and you need support, we're here for you. And we've got funding to work with specialists that you won't cost you a cent. Okay, so please reach out to us about that as well. Have you got your links in there, guys? So people can grab them before I shut us down?
Yeah, I
You
want to
bet.
put one more link in there. This is one of the resources that I had mentioned to one of the groups that I went into. And so it's a Slack group that's about local entrepreneurs and business owners and founders. So the yigstartup.slack.com, and it's a very active conversation.
Awesome. Okay. Well, everybody, I hope that you got something out of today. I will have Justin's slides to send out to anybody who wants them, as well as the workbook. So if you want access to those, please let me know. I will be sending out a short survey, so you can reply to that email, just asking for what you need. Thank you very much, Justin and Joel, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Really appreciate your time.